Thanks for the introduction, Jack. G'day everyone. I'm coming to you live from Gadabanud country, and as Jack mentioned earlier, all of the work that we're going to be talking about over these next few sessions has also taken place on Gadabanud country. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, acknowledge any traditional owners who are joining us here today, and just note that it's a real privilege to work into this landscape. The core basis of the entire PhD that I'll be doing over the next couple of years is around predator-prey dynamics before and after fire in the Carlisle Heath, but that's a pretty dry way of explaining it. So instead, I'm going to frame it around the burn scar wars. And in particular for this presentation, we're going to focus on the phantom menace that is invasive predators. And as a really brief recap, we have been focusing quite heavily on the prey side of the equation in terms of how the prey species, in this case long-nosed potoroos, respond to fire. And it's been a pretty grim story so far. Of the 20 potoroos that have been exposed to fire, only 4 of them have actually survived long enough to need us to go back out, retrap them and get those collars back. So we're looking at about an 80% mortality rate thus far. And what that GPS data that we've collected so far is telling us is that these animals show a really strong reluctance to shift their home range areas after the fire. So regardless of how much of their range is burnt, they're still trying to eke out an existence in the same areas after the fire. And this is putting them in a really precarious position. But there's still so much we don't know about how predators are responding to fire into this landscape until now. Through the Wild Otways initiative, we were able to secure funding to get out there and attach GPS collars to individual cats and foxes in the Carlisle Heath landscape. And they've really just given us a wealth of information to work through. Now, because this information is still being collected, these incomplete data sets, I'm going to give you guys sort of a preliminary overview of what we've found thus far. We're going to keep it fairly surface level. There's not going to be any complicated statistics, but we're going to talk through some of the interesting things we've seen already. And just to summarize, we've caught 7 foxes and 5 cats, and they're out there collecting information every single hour. The great thing about working with larger species and larger collars is that these collars have a substantially longer battery life. We can follow potoroos for about 6 weeks. We can follow predators for about 9 months. So we got out there nice and early in preparation for this year's burn season and attached GPS collars to as many of these predators as we could. They've been exposed to 2 fires so far. And as I mentioned, they are incomplete data sets. But fortunately, we don't have to wait until we get the collars back. We can get out there and download the data intermittently if we can get close enough to these animals. And that's what I've been doing quite often over the last 6 months. One of the first things that we've found thus far on the face of it is that the really structurally complex and thick environments where we know long-nosed potoroos and other species like southern brown bandicoots seem to thrive just don't seem to be strongly preferenced by introduced predators in this landscape. Instead, they're often selecting for roads, waterways, linear features that are easy to traverse. An example here is one of our cats, Gaston. We're going to see a lot from Gaston. He's just been my favourite cat so far, and we've learned a lot. And this is his movement data over the last 7 months. And what you can see immediately is these linear features really serve as a bit of a backbone upon which he can base his activities and his hunting. What this perhaps leaves us with is a broad general range that encapsulates large areas of the Carlisle Heath, but pockets within that range that just really aren't frequented by this individual animal. Interestingly, some of these pockets also entail areas that have been burnt as recently as last year or the year before. And it's not just cats that seem to be displaying this sort of behaviour. We're looking at Ursula now, a fox who lives a little bit further to the west. And what Ursula likes to do is effectively zoomies. She spends her daytime most frequently resting within the heathy woodland of the Carlisle and then using roads and linear features to make these nightly excursions to an agricultural boundary, where presumably it's probably a bit easier to encounter prey like rabbits. I wouldn't go so far as to say that introduced predators hate heathy woodland in all of its forms, solely because it can be really different, even though it all falls under that umbrella of an environmental vegetation class. How open it is, how easy it is to walk through, and how potentially easy it is to encounter prey can depend on the vegetation that makes up that area, its disturbance history, and even things like slope and aspect and the age at which that vegetation is can really influence the structural complexity of that environment. The second thing that we found so far is that predators don't seem to follow the rules all that much. And we're going to have a look at a fox, Scar, and a cat, Hades, to try and demonstrate this. And Scar's an interesting one. Scar, we're seeing his movement data animated here. He's an animal that I effectively had written off. We caught him in the heath and he buggered off 4 kilometres away. He then spent the next 2 months or so living exclusively in quite a small little area, coming out into the field to hunt. But then he started to make forays back into the heath. And interestingly, he started to live between these 2 areas over about 2 months. And then the most recent update of his data suggests that he actually hasn't revisited that field site for several weeks now. So is Scar a field fox or is he a forest fox? Kind of depends on when you're asking that question. With Hades, our cat here, we can see, yes, he does spend quite a bit of time in the heathy woodlands of the Carlisle Heath, but also he'll make excursions out to nearby forestry environments. These are environments that have been recently cleared in the last 2 years, and environments that we know anecdotally support healthy populations of species like rabbits. So perhaps he's exploiting this adjacent country. You know, if he's had a couple of bad nights in the heathy woodland, he goes to where he knows he probably can catch more food. And he also has displayed some pretty interesting extraterritorial movements. He's got his core area that he likes to hang in, but then he's gone walkabout effectively for 2 or 3 nights, several kilometres north of his home range, potentially in search of food or mates. So not really following the rules. In terms of how these species are responding to fire though, there's 2 things we've observed thus far. I do want to caution again that this is preliminary information, but it might just be the locals that are responding to fire. To demonstrate this, we can look at the first of our burns that we've observed this year in this region. This was a burn that was conducted in mid-March, primarily for the purposes of fuel reduction. And we have 3 individual foxes here, Ursula, Scar, and Cruella to the south. These are animals that have lived at varying distances from that burn, but have not appeared to uprooted their lives and move into that burn area and exploit it. Ursula, interestingly, only lives about 200 metres away from a burn scar, but she hasn't displayed a really strong response to fire. This is a really positive sign. It means perhaps we're not going to face a situation where every fire we put in is drawing animals from kilometres away into that burnt landscape. We do, however, have some animals that live nearby, and these are animals that appear to have displayed quite a strong response to this fire. And so we're going to look into this in a little bit more detail now. We're going to look at Gaston in the yellow, a cat, and Maleficent in the purple, a fox. One of the simplest ways that we can try and eyeball this data to see if we're observing a response to fire is simply counting how often this animal was picked up within that broad burn block before the fire and how often he was detected in the burn block after the fire. What we're seeing here is pre-fire movement points. He's popped his head in here and there, but he really hasn't seemed to have spent a lot of time in this burn block. After the fire, however, is a completely different story. What we're seeing here is an animal that has shifted his activity and his movements northward, further north than really he's spent any time before, and really starting to hunt quite intensively within the areas of unburnt vegetation remaining within the burn scar. And that was quite a stark and concerning finding. It's all well and good to see that this animal was in that burn block after fire, but I also think it's equally important to know when and how he used this burn area. And to do that, we can effectively do the same thing, except we can count how often he was picked in this burn block every single night. And so what we can do is for each night of his deployment, we can count how many fixes fell within the burn block. What this results in is a series of points for each night. If we have a high number of fixes for that night, it means he spent a long time and a lot of his effort for that evening in that burn area. If we're getting absolutely no fixes in the block on any given night, it means he's elsewhere in his range. So we can use it as a bit of a proxy for how intensely he's using this environment. And we can also follow it through time, okay? So we can plot it as a bit of a time series from when we collared him through to when we got the most recent update from his data set. And ideally, there's a fire in there in the middle. And that's what we're about to see now. Prior to the fire, Gaston popped his head into this burn block and spent a bit of time there for a night or two. But really, over the course of 100 days, you'd be hard-pressed to say that this was an area frequently used by this animal. After the fire, however, completely different story. After detecting the fire, Gaston effectively spent the next 7 consecutive nights, spending almost his entire time hunting within this burn scar. And you can see upwards of about 70 days, he was still revisiting this area frequently. What about Maleficent, the fox who lives nearby? Well, Maleficent, unfortunately, we didn't capture very long before the fire was put in, so we don't have a lot of pre-fire information to speak to. But in terms of the same kind of information about how intensely she used this burn block each night, we can see that it does appear as if she displayed a response to fire. She certainly moved in and used that area pretty intensively, but for a much shorter time period than Gaston. Jury's still out as to why that is. Finally, one of the last things I'll talk about is how a burn scar is used might depend on the actual burn scar itself. To do this, we're going to look at the second fire that was conducted in mid-June, and we're going to revisit Gaston again. Same story. We're going to look at the burn block, and we're going to try and assess how frequently he was detected in that burn block before and after the fire. What we're looking at is before fire. You can see the linear features that bound this block, the gullies and the roads. Sure, certainly used by Gaston, but in the guts of this block, doesn't look like it's an area that he's really used all that intensively. After the fire, however, we see him using areas that he previously hasn't in the past 6 months of his collar deployment. And interestingly, these fixes appear to be really focused around the edge of the burn scar. And that's in direct contrast to what we saw earlier with how Gaston used the burn block from the March burn. The same animal in terms of, we're looking at Gaston, his response to fire from the first burn up top and the second burn down the bottom. Same animal responding to the fire in a different way and for different lengths of time. One potential hint that we might have to go off when it comes to why we might see a different response to fire each time is due to the fact that it's not just, in this case, Gaston, making a decision about whether he and he alone is going to exploit this burn area. This second burn, we fortunately had some capacity to do some post-fire monitoring. We got out there and we put camera grids in immediately after the fire. And we actually detected within that relatively small area, 3 individual cats and 3 individual foxes. And so what this means is when a predator is deciding to use a burn area, sure, they may need to weigh up the benefits that come from perhaps having an increased chance to encounter prey, but there are risks that when it comes to using that burn area as well, particularly when it comes to cats. They probably don't want to try and come directly across any foxes in the landscape. So that may play some role as to why we're seeing a different response to fire. Finally, looking forward, what are the next steps? Well, this is all of our animals and all of the data we've collected from the predators thus far in this Carlisle Heath landscape. And only a few weeks ago, 2 fires were conducted. And we can see in these 2 locations, they're in the prime area where we might expect some of our collared animals to respond to the fire. And the exciting thing about these burns is they are our first attempt to try something different to improve the survival of native mammals after fire. As Jack referenced, one of them is a deliberately patchier burn scar, and the other is to integrate some sort of lethal control and try and take out these predators before they have a chance to really, hyperpredate species like long-nosed potoroos and bandicoots after fire. And what's been wonderful is we've absolutely been busting our guts, the CEC team, the interns and colleagues and volunteers, to get out there at both of these burn blocks, catch long-nosed potoroos and attach GPS collars to them. At both of those burn blocks, there are 7 potoroos running around with GPS collars. And the exciting part is this is the very first time that we've had both predators and prey simultaneously collared and exposed to fire. So what will the outcome be? Well, unfortunately, the data's still being collected. I don't know if it's going to be a case of the Return of the Jedi or perhaps, a Revenge of the Sith situation where the predators win. And finally, just as a huge right-hand turn from this whole Star Wars motif, I wanted to give our long-nosed potoroos this year the absolute best chance of survival. So I've named them all after the Avengers. Today, there is a little Iron Man, there is a little Captain America, a Black Widow and a chunky Hulk bouncing around these burn blocks. Fingers crossed this time next year, I'll be able to pull all this data together and we can hopefully have a much happier story when it comes to how these animals have survived post-fire. And that's pretty much me.
As always, my friend, you've used all of your time, including your question time. So I will ask you to shift on over to the Q&A section, and they've got some great questions there if you wouldn't mind addressing some of those.